The rain fell cold and merciless upon the stone steps of St. Margaret's Chapel, each droplet striking the ancient granite with the sharp insistence of a creditor's knock, and Lady Eleanor Ashford stood in her ivory wedding gown, feeling the dampness seep through the thin satin slippers her late mother had worn decades before, her hands trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the terrible certainty of what this day truly meant. Beside her, tall as a monument and twice as cold, stood Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravensmoor, his dark hair sleek against his head, his grey eyes fixed somewhere beyond the gathered witnesses and beyond the weeping clouds, perhaps calculating figures and tonnage and profit margins, even as the vicar droned through vows that should have bound two souls, but instead merely transferred assets from one ledger to another. Eleanor could hear the whispers rippling through the pews behind them, the sympathetic murmurs of those who knew her father had been dead scarce 6 months, the more pointed observations about the Duke's sudden interest in matrimony, coinciding so conveniently with Lord Thomas Ashford's passing and the question of who would inherit his vast shipping empire, those merchant vessels that plied routes from London to the East Indies, their holds heavy with tea and silk and spices, that had built a fortune substantial enough to tempt even a duke whose ancient title could not mask the scent of financial desperation. She knew, of course, she had always known. When Adrian had called upon her 3 weeks after her father's funeral, his condolences as perfunctory as a business correspondence, when he had requested permission to court her with all the passion of a man ordering boots from his cobbler, when he had proposed in her father's study surrounded by the maps and manifests that represented the true object of his desire, Eleanor had understood with painful clarity that she was not a bride but a key, a means of access to the merchant fleet and trading contracts that she had inherited, the price the Duke was willing to pay being merely his name and title in exchange for her fortune. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical efficiency, each ritual observed, each word spoken, but there was no tremor of emotion in the Duke's voice when he pledged to honor and cherish, no warmth in his fingers when he slipped the cold gold band onto her hand, and when he lifted her veil to seal their union with a kiss, his lips barely grazed her cheek in a gesture so perfunctory it might have been a handshake. Eleanor signed the marriage register with her maiden name for the final time, watching as Adrian signed with bold, decisive strokes, the same hand that would soon sign orders and contracts for her father's ships, and then it was done. She was the Duchess of Ravensmoor, a title that should have filled her with pride, but instead felt like a shroud. The carriage that bore them away from the chapel was as silent as a hearse, the rain streaming down the windows, obscuring the faces of the onlookers who had gathered to witness the union of ancient nobility and new wealth, and Eleanor sat across from her husband watching his profile as he stared out at the grey landscape, his expression revealing nothing, not satisfaction at his acquisition, not regret at the coldness of their bargain, nothing but the same calculating distance she had seen from the first, and she understood that whatever life awaited her at Ravensmoor Hall, it would not include the foolish dreams of affection she had once harbored as a girl when her father still lived, and the future had seemed bright with possibility rather than dark with transaction. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Ravensmoor Hall rose from the moorland like a monument to all things austere and unforgiving, its grey stone walls the colour of storm clouds, its countless windows reflecting the dying light with the cold glitter of indifferent eyes. And as the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks that had shed their leaves in surrender to autumn's advance, Eleanor felt something inside her contract with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the realization that this vast, unwelcoming edifice was now her home, her prison, the place where she would live out her days as a transaction rather than a wife. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a woman whose spine was as straight as the hall's columns and whose expression revealed nothing but dutiful courtesy, greeted them in the entrance hall, where marble floors stretched in every direction and the ceiling soared 2 stories above, making Eleanor feel smaller than she had ever felt in her life, and when the Duke, for she could not yet think of him as Adrian, could not think of him with any intimacy whatsoever, instructed Mrs. Davison to show the Duchess to her chambers, emphasizing the word in a way that made clear these would be her chambers and hers alone. Eleanor followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase with the resignation of a prisoner being led to her cell. The rooms were beautiful in their way, furnished with obvious expense if not warmth. The bed hung with heavy curtains in deep burgundy, the windows overlooking the wild moorland that stretched endlessly toward a horizon already darkening with evening. And as a pair of maids unpacked her trunks with efficient silence, Eleanor stood at the window and wondered if her father had known, when he built his shipping empire, when he accumulated his fortune through years of tireless work, that it would ultimately serve only to make his daughter a commodity valuable enough to tempt a duke who needed capital more than he needed companionship. She did not see Adrian again until dinner, and when she descended to the dining room at the appointed hour, she found him already seated at the head of a table so long it seemed designed to emphasize distance rather than bridge it. And he rose with perfunctory politeness as she entered, gestured to the chair that had been placed far enough away that conversation would require effort, and throughout the meal, course after course of expertly prepared food that tasted like ashes in her mouth, he spoke only of business matters, of a meeting scheduled in London, of a shipment expected from India, of tonnage and tariffs and profit margins, asking her nothing about her comfort, her opinions, her adjustment to her new home, looking at her when necessary, but somehow managing to look through her at the same time, as though she were made of glass, as though she were merely another fixture of the hall he had acquired, along with the shipping contracts. Eleanor observed him as she picked at her food, noting despite herself that he was handsome in the way of classical statuary, all sharp lines and aristocratic angles, his dark hair catching the candlelight, his grey eyes intelligent and keen when they focused on anything other than her, and she wondered what manner of man could be so cold. What childhood or circumstance had taught him that a wife was merely another asset to be managed, another entry in a ledger? And when the interminable meal finally ended, and he excused himself to his study without even the courtesy of a good night, she climbed the stairs to her solitary chamber and lay awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, vast and empty, and echoing with a loneliness so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very stones. And she understood that whatever life she had imagined for herself had died with her father, and what remained was merely this: existing in proximity to a man who had married her for her inheritance and would likely never see her as anything more than the price he had paid for his financial salvation. 3 weeks passed in this manner, 21 days that blurred together into a pattern of such rigid predictability that Eleanor could have navigated Ravensmoor Hall blindfolded, her mornings beginning alone in the small breakfast room where pale sunlight struggled through leaded windows, her meals taken in solitude while Adrian had already departed for his early morning rides across the moor. The rides, she knew, had less to do with pleasure than with avoiding her company, and she would sit with her tea growing cold, listening to the clock in the hallway mark each quarter hour with solemn precision, before retreating to the gardens where autumn had begun its work in earnest, stripping the roses of their final blooms, sending leaves skittering across the gravel paths, like whispered warnings of the winter to come. Her afternoons she spent in the small parlour that Mrs. Davison had designated as suitable for the Duchess, her embroidery hoop a prop more than a passion, her needle-making stitches that had no purpose beyond filling the hours that stretched before dinner like an empty sea, and occasionally she would hear Adrian's voice echoing from some distant corridor as he spoke with his steward. Mr. Thornton. Their conversation always centered on manifests and cargo schedules, tonnage calculations and port fees, the language of commerce that had become the only language her husband seemed to speak. Dinner remained the single daily occasion when they occupied the same room for more than a passing moment, but even this ritual had calcified into something that resembled companionship, only in the most technical sense. Adrian would arrive precisely at 7, having spent the intervening hours closeted in his study with ledgers and correspondence, and throughout the meal he would read letters from his shipping agents, occasionally commenting aloud about a delayed vessel or favorable market conditions, asking Eleanor nothing about her day, her comfort, her thoughts, and his eyes when they flickered toward her containing no more warmth than they might offer a portrait on the wall, and she began to understand that to him she had already served her purpose, the marriage contract signed, the shipping empire transferred, and what remained was merely the tedious formality of cohabitation. She noticed small cruelties that perhaps he did not even recognize as such, The way he spoke of expanding the trade routes her father had built, as though claiming credit for another man's lifetime of work. The way he discussed potential ventures without consulting her, though it was her inheritance that funded them. And one afternoon, wandering through corridors she had not yet explored, Eleanor discovered a storage room where furniture too damaged or outdated for display had been relegated to dusty obscurity. And there, leaning against tea crates and broken chairs, she found her father's portrait, the painting that had hung in his study for 20 years, his kind eyes and gentle smile now facing a wall as though his memory itself had become inconvenient. In its place in the main hall, she had noticed that morning, Adrian had hung framed maps of shipping routes, charts that showed the Far East trade lanes, marked with precise notations in her father's hand, the routes themselves preserved and honored, while the man who had created them was hidden away like an embarrassment. And Eleanor had stood before that storage room for a long time, something hardening inside her chest, a small hurt that joined the accumulation of other small hurts, each one alone perhaps forgivable, but together forming a weight that pressed against her heart with increasing heaviness, until she wondered if this was to be her entire life, a ghost in her own home, married to a man who saw her as nothing more than the key that had unlocked his financial salvation. Eleanor discovered quite by accident that invisibility, while painful, afforded certain freedoms, for when one is not truly seen, one can move through spaces unnoticed, and it was during one such unnoticed passage through the corridors of Ravensmoor Hall that she overheard Mrs. Davison explaining to a new maid about the household accounts, mentioning that the estate ledgers were kept in the library's eastern alcove, and though Eleanor had no particular design in seeking them out, she found herself drawn to the library the following afternoon when Adrian was closeted with Mr. Thornton discussing timber contracts, and there in the alcove she discovered not only the current household accounts but older ledgers as well, records that stretched back 5 years, and what she read in those careful columns of figures told a story far more revealing than any conversation she had shared with her husband. The numbers painted a portrait of steady decline, of an estate hemorrhaging money despite every economy, of debts mounting like storm clouds on a summer horizon, of a duke whose title and lands meant nothing against the cold mathematics of insolvency, and Eleanor sat in the window seat with the ledgers spread around her and understood with crystalline clarity that Adrian had not merely desired her father's fortune, he had desperately needed it, had been perhaps months away from ruin, from losing Ravensmoor Hall and everything his family had held for generations, and this knowledge did not excuse his coldness, but at least explained it, cast his calculated courtship and emotionless efficiency in a different light, the light of a drowning man grasping for salvation rather than a mercenary claiming spoils. She returned the ledgers to their place and continued her wandering through the library, running her fingers along leather spines, and there in a cabinet she had not previously explored, she found a collection of her father's correspondence, letters he had written to Adrian during the courtship, and reading them was like hearing his voice again, his pride in the business he had built from nothing, his hope that his daughter would be well cared for, his detailed explanations of trade routes and partnerships, and the innovations he had planned but would never live to implement. And Eleanor sat with tears streaming down her face, mourning not just her father but the knowledge he had given her, the hours he had spent teaching her about ships and navigation, about reading weather patterns and calculating cargo loads, about the delicate diplomacy required to maintain relationships with merchants in Canton and Bombay and Port Said, all the wisdom he had poured into her because he had no son, and she had been eager to learn, and she realized with bitter clarity that Adrian had never once asked if she knew anything about the empire he had married her to obtain, had simply assumed she was decorative and ignorant, another asset to be managed rather than a partner who might contribute. The following morning, emboldened by frustration and grief in equal measure, Eleanor encountered Mr. Thornton in the hallway and inquired, with careful politeness, about the route being planned for the India run, and when he explained the intended passage, she suggested, almost diffidently, that her father had always preferred a slightly more southern course during autumn months to avoid the worst of the monsoon patterns, and Mr. Thornton had smiled at her with the same polite condescension one might offer a child discussing adult matters, assured her that the Duke's plans were most carefully considered, and moved on, leaving Eleanor standing in the corridor with her hands clenched at her sides, her expertise dismissed, her knowledge rendered invisible just as she herself had been rendered invisible, and she understood that this was to be another loss. Not only her father and her home and any hope of affection from her husband, but also her competence, her intelligence, and the parts of herself that her father had valued and nurtured, all of it set aside because she inhabited a body that men had been taught not to take seriously, and the frustration burned in her chest like swallowed fire, contained but consuming nonetheless. The evening arrived with the kind of bitter wind that rattled the window panes and sent servants scurrying to build up fires in every grate, and Eleanor entered the dining room at precisely 7 o'clock, as had become their unvarying custom, expecting the usual perfunctory meal, the usual silence broken only by the rustle of Adrian's correspondence. But the moment she crossed the threshold, she sensed something different in the atmosphere, a tension that hummed like a plucked string, and she found Adrian already seated, his posture rigid, a telegram crumpled beside his plate, and a glass of wine his second, she noted, for another sat empty, held in his hand, with enough force that his knuckles had gone white. He looked up as she entered, and for once his eyes actually focused on her face rather than sliding past toward some middle distance, though what she saw in them was not warmth but a kind of barely controlled agitation, and through dinner he ate nothing, simply poured himself a third glass and then a fourth, drinking with mechanical precision while staring at the telegram as though he could change its contents through sheer force of will. And finally, Eleanor, unable to bear the oppressive silence, asked with careful neutrality whether the news was troubling, and Adrian's laugh was sharp and bitter as he pushed the telegram across the table toward her. She read it quickly, her father's training allowing her to grasp immediately the implications. The Times Morning Star Asterisk, one of the largest vessels in the fleet, had failed to arrive in Bombay, was 3 weeks overdue, and the cargo of Chinese silks and porcelain represented a staggering sum, enough to damage even a healthy business and potentially crippling given what Eleanor now understood about their financial situation. Which route did she take? Eleanor asked quietly, her voice careful, and Adrian looked at her with something almost like surprise, as though he had forgotten she could speak in complete sentences, and he told her the Northern Passage, the faster route. And Eleanor felt her heart sink, because she knew, had learned at her father's knee, that the Northern Passage in late autumn was treacherous, that the monsoon patterns shifted unpredictably, and the Bay of Bengal became a graveyard for ships that tried to shave days off their journey by courting those dangerous waters. The northern route, she said, not quite a question, and something in her tone made Adrian set down his glass and truly look at her, his eyes sharpening with attention that was entirely new, and she continued, "My father always avoided the Northern Passage after September. The weather patterns are too unstable, the risk of storms too great, and he lost a ship there in '38 and swore never again." And she watched Adrian's face transform, saw surprise give way to something else. A dawning realization that perhaps his wife was not merely decorative, that perhaps she possessed knowledge he had never thought to access, and he leaned forward, his earlier agitation channeling into focus, and asked her what route her father had preferred. Eleanor told him about the longer southern passage, the way her father had cultivated relationships with harbour masters in Ceylon who would send word of weather conditions, the careful calculations of time versus safety, and Adrian listened with an intensity that might have been flattering had it not been born of desperation. And when she finished, he sat back, something crumbling in his expression, and she realized he was calculating how much money his ignorance might have cost, how his assumption that he knew better than the man who had spent 40 years building this empire had perhaps sent a ship and its crew to their deaths. The meal ended in silence, but it was a different quality of silence, charged with unspoken recognitions, and Adrian retreated to his study without a word, and Eleanor retired to her chambers, expecting nothing more from the evening. But hours later, unable to sleep, she walked the corridors and saw the thin line of lamplight beneath his study door, and something compelled her to check, and she found the door unlocked and him asleep at his desk, his head pillowed on his arms, surrounded by maps and ledgers, and her father's correspondence spread in desperate constellation around him, and in sleep his face had lost its hard edges, the harsh lines of calculation and control smoothed away to reveal someone younger, someone who looked almost vulnerable, and Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, before quietly retrieving a blanket from the library and draping it across his shoulders, her hand hovering for just a heartbeat near his dark hair before she pulled away and left him sleeping. And she did not know why she had offered even that small tenderness to a man who had shown her none, except that in his exhaustion and worry she had glimpsed, perhaps, a human being beneath the cold facade, and that frightened her almost as much as it moved her. 2 months into their marriage, Adrian appeared at breakfast, an unusual occurrence in itself, for he typically took his morning meal in his study while reviewing correspondence, and announced with his characteristic curtness that they would be traveling to Portsmouth within the week, that his presence was required to meet with shipping partners and inspect the fleet, and that Eleanor would accompany him. For appearances, he added after a pause that made the addendum seem almost apologetic, though his tone remained clipped and formal. The days that followed were filled with preparations, trunks packed by efficient maids, Eleanor's traveling clothes laid out and pressed, and she found herself experiencing a strange flutter of something that might have been anticipation or anxiety, for she had not left Ravensmoor Hall since arriving as a bride, and the prospect of travel, even in Adrian's distant company, represented at least a change from the monotonous routine that had calcified around them. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day where frost silvered the grass and one's breath misted in the air, and Eleanor sat across from Adrian in the carriage as they rolled down the long drive and onto the road that would carry them south and east toward the coast, and for the first hour they maintained their usual silence, Adrian occupied with papers he had brought, Eleanor watching the countryside slide past the window, but then something shifted, some subtle relaxation in the atmosphere, and Adrian set aside his work and began, haltingly at first, to point out landmarks, the old Saxon church in the village they passed, the estate of a family he had known in childhood, and the ridge, where one could see 3 counties on a clear day, and though his commentary was brief and factual, Eleanor found herself grateful for these small offerings, these fragments of knowledge about the world beyond Ravensmoor's walls. The countryside grew wilder as they travelled, the cultivated fields giving way to rougher terrain, forests of oak and ash pressing close to the road, and Eleanor noticed how the farms grew more scattered, the villages smaller and more isolated, and there was something both beautiful and unsettling about this wilderness. The way civilization seemed to thin and fray at the edges. They stopped as evening fell at an inn that crouched beside the road like something from a fairy tale, all dark timbers and diamond-paned windows glowing with firelight, and Adrian arranged their accommodations with the innkeeper, securing separate rooms without consultation in a manner that no longer surprised Eleanor, though it still carried a small sting, and she found herself at the window of her chamber as twilight deepened into night, looking down at the courtyard where Adrian stood alone, smoking a cigarette, his face tilted toward the horizon where the last light was fading, and something in his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood so utterly alone, despite the bustle of the inn around him, spoke of a loneliness that Eleanor recognized because it mirrored her own, and she wondered if he felt it too, this peculiar isolation of 2 people bound by law and contract, but separated by walls more impenetrable than stone. She was turning from the window when she heard the innkeeper's voice drift up from below, warning Adrian about bandits that had been plaguing the road, suggesting he hire guards for the remainder of the journey, and Eleanor watched as Adrian dismissed the concern with a curt wave, his confidence absolute, and she felt a tremor of unease that she could not quite name, a premonition that settled cold in her chest as she finally turned away and prepared for a restless night's sleep. The next morning dawned wrapped in mist, the kind that clung to the ground and muffled sound until the world seemed wrapped in grey wool, and Eleanor felt the unease from the previous night settle more heavily on her shoulders as she took her seat in the carriage, though she told herself she was being foolish, and that the innkeeper's warnings were the sort of rural superstition that plagued every isolated road in England, and Adrian seemed utterly unconcerned as he arranged their luggage and gave instructions to the driver in his usual clipped manner, before settling across from her with a sheaf of papers that clearly intended to occupy his attention for the journey ahead. The road narrowed as they traveled deeper into the forest, ancient oaks pressing close on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead that turned the misty morning into something close to twilight, and autumn leaves, gold and crimson and brown, drifted down in lazy spirals to carpet the road, beautiful and melancholy, And there was something unsettling about the quiet, the way even the horses' hooves seemed muffled, the way no birds sang in the dense wood, and Eleanor found herself watching the shadows between the trees with growing tension, though she could not have said what she feared to see there. They had travelled perhaps 2 hours when the attack came, with shocking suddenness, masked riders exploding from the tree line on both sides of the road, their horses' hooves thunder after the eerie quiet, their voices shouting demands that Eleanor's mind could barely process through the surge of pure animal terror, and the driver tried to whip the horses into flight, but the bandits had planned well and had blocked the road ahead, and Adrian was suddenly moving, lunging across the carriage to push Eleanor down onto the floor, his body covering hers, and she heard him shouting something to the driver, heard the crack of gunfire that made her ears ring, felt the carriage rock violently as the horses screamed and reared, and everything was chaos, confusion, the smell of gun smoke and fear sweat, and the terrible sounds of violence erupting around their fragile wooden shelter. Adrian was half standing, one hand still pressing Eleanor down, the other reaching for something she realized with shock that he had produced a pistol from somewhere, was firing back at their attackers, and through the small gap between his arm and the carriage wall, Eleanor caught glimpses of masked faces, of gloved hands tearing at the luggage, of the driver struggling with a bandit who had climbed onto the box. And then there was another shot, closer, louder, and something struck Eleanor's side with force that drove the breath from her lungs, a sensation not of pain at first, but of profound shock, of wrongness. And she looked down in numb disbelief to see her travelling dress darkening with blood, the stain spreading with terrible speed across the grey fabric, and her mind tried to make sense of it, even as her body began to understand, pain blooming hot and sharp where the bullet had torn through flesh. The world tilted, sounds growing distant and strange, and through the gathering haze Eleanor saw Adrian's face suddenly above hers, saw his expression transform from cold calculation to something she had never seen there before, raw, undisguised fear, his eyes wide and his face gone white beneath its tan, and she heard him shouting her name, not Lady Ravensmoor, not even my lady, but Eleanor, her Christian name spoken with desperate urgency, and his hands were on her side, pressing against the wound, and she wanted to tell him it was quite all right, that she felt rather distant from the whole affair, but the darkness was rising like a tide, and his face was fading, and the last thing she registered before consciousness slipped away was the sound of her name again on his lips, and the realization, dim but certain, that everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat. Adrian's mind, which had spent 2 months calculating shipping routes and profit margins with cold precision, suddenly narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity as he looked down at Eleanor's pale face, her blood spreading across his hands where he pressed his coat against the wound in her side. And the bandits were fleeing now, their shouts fading into the forest as they made off with trunks and valuables that Adrian found he could not even remember caring about. And the driver was slumped on the box, groaning but alive, and the horses had scattered in their terror, and none of it mattered. Nothing in the entire world mattered except the fact that Eleanor was bleeding, that her breathing came in shallow gasps, that her eyes had rolled back, showing only white before fluttering closed, and Adrian heard himself saying her name over and over, Eleanor, Eleanor, stay with me. And his hands were shaking as he tried to assess the wound, tried to remember anything useful from his years of shooting parties and military campaigns, and he could see that the bullet had entered below her ribs on the left side, and he did not know if it had struck anything vital, did not know if she was dying in his arms right now, and the terror that seized him was unlike anything he had ever experienced, more visceral than any business failure, more devastating than the night he had learned his estate was crumbling into ruin. He shouted to the driver, demanded to know the nearest doctor, and the man, barely conscious himself, blood streaming from a cut on his temple, managed to gasp that the village they had passed that morning had a physician. And Adrian's mind began calculating even through the panic, 20 miles at least, perhaps more, the horses gone and scattered through the forest, the driver in no condition to manage them even if they could be found, and Eleanor's breathing growing more labored with each passing moment, and the choice crystallized before him with the terrible clarity of absolute necessity. He would carry her, would walk the 20 miles back to that village, would not stop or rest or falter because the alternative was unthinkable, was a void that yawned before him, darker than any he had imagined possible. He stripped off his coat, wadded it against her wound, then lifted her into his arms, and she was so light, lighter than he had imagined, and her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her blood seeping through his waistcoat, and he began walking, back the way they had come, along the forest road that suddenly seemed to stretch infinitely before him. With each step, his mind turned over a question that he could not answer, could not even fully articulate. When had she become essential? When had the quiet woman who sat across from him at dinner, who walked alone in the gardens, who asked intelligent questions that he had dismissed or ignored, when had she transformed from a means to an end into someone whose loss would tear something vital from his chest? He thought of their wedding day, how he had barely looked at her face, how he had calculated the value of the shipping contracts even as he spoke his vows, and shame burned through him hotter than the exertion of carrying her, and he adjusted his grip, felt her breath warm against his neck, and kept walking as the autumn sun climbed higher, and the forest path stretched on before him, and he whispered to her, though she could not hear, promised things he had never thought to promise anyone, and knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his carefully constructed life had prepared him for this moment, when everything he had thought mattered revealed itself as dust and shadow compared to the weight of her in his arms and the desperate hope that he would not be too late. Adrian had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, though time had taken on a strange quality where he could not be certain if minutes or lifetimes were passing, and his arms ached with a deep burning pain that radiated through his shoulders and down his back. His breathing labored as he picked his way along the forest road that seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and Eleanor's weight, so light at first, had become a burden that tested the limits of his endurance, though he would sooner have died than set her down, would sooner have collapsed entirely than failed in this desperate mission. He talked to her constantly, his voice hoarse and rough, saying her name, telling her to stay with him, pleading with her in a way he had never pleaded for anything in his carefully controlled life. And sometimes she stirred slightly, her head moving against his shoulder, a small sound escaping her lips. And these tiny signs of life were the only things that kept his feet moving forward when every muscle screamed for rest. The autumn sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy of leaves overhead in shafts of golden light that would have been beautiful if Adrian had possessed any capacity to notice beauty, and his mind, seeking escape from the physical torment and the crushing fear, began to turn over memories like a man examining evidence of his own crimes, and he remembered their wedding day with sudden terrible clarity, how he had stood beside her in that cold chapel and calculated shipping routes, even as he spoke his vows, how he had looked at her pale hands, trembling as she signed the register, and felt nothing but satisfaction that the contracts were now his, how he had sat across from her in the carriage afterward and reviewed ledgers instead of speaking to his new wife, and the shame of it crashed over him in waves that matched the rhythm of his labored steps. He remembered dinners where she had sat across the long table at Ravensmoor Hall, quiet and composed, sometimes attempting conversation that he had deflected with curt responses or ignored entirely as he read correspondence. And he had treated her like furniture, like a fixture of his house that required no more attention than a chair or a table, useful only insofar as it served his purposes, and the guilt was a physical thing now, as heavy as her body in his arms, as sharp as the pain in his shoulders. Eleanor stirred again, mumbled something indistinct, and he caught his father's name, Thomas, spoken with such longing that Adrian's chest tightened, and he realized with stunning clarity that he had never asked about her grief, had never acknowledged that she had lost her father mere months before their marriage, had never considered that she might be mourning, might need comfort or understanding, or simple human kindness, and instead he had taken everything her father built and ignored the daughter who had loved him, and the cruelty of it, the thoughtless, calculated cruelty, made Adrian want to stop walking and weep, but he could not stop, would not stop, because stopping meant she might die, and that had become unthinkable. He adjusted his grip, feeling her blood still seeping warm through his shirt, and he kept walking through the dappled sunlight, through the beauty of autumn that mocked his desperation, and he whispered promises to her unconscious form, promised to be better, to see her, to value her, if only she would live, if only he was not too late. Eleanor existed in a twilight world where past and present wove together like threads on a loom, the patterns indistinguishable and strange, and she could not say with any certainty whether she was lying in her childhood bed at Ashford House, or floating in darkness, or dying in some nameless forest. And through it all she felt arms around her, strong and unrelenting, and heard a voice that seemed to come from very far away, calling her back from wherever she was drifting. In the fever dreams that consumed her consciousness, she was a child again, standing on the docks at Portsmouth with her father, and the salt air filled her lungs as he pointed to the great merchant ships at anchor, his voice warm with pride as he explained how to read the wind, how to calculate routes across vast oceans, how the stars at night could guide a vessel home, and she listened with fierce attention because these moments with him were precious, were everything, and he smiled down at her and said that one day all of this would be hers to steward, that he trusted her to honor what he had built, and she wanted to tell him that she had tried, that she had wanted to be worthy, but the dream shifted, and she was standing in a cold chapel, in a dress that felt like a shroud, and beside her was a stranger with a hard, beautiful face who spoke vows without once meeting her eyes, and she knew with terrible clarity that her father's ships were all this stranger wanted, that she herself was merely the inconvenient vessel through which the transaction must be completed, and the grief of it, the loneliness, crashed over her in waves that left her gasping. Then suddenly the dream changed again, and she was in the carriage, and there was noise and chaos and terror, and pain bloomed hot and sharp in her side, and she looked up to see Adrian's face above her, and something in his expression was different, was raw and afraid in a way she had never seen, and he was saying her name, her actual name, not the title he used like a barrier between them, and even through the pain and fear, she recognized that something fundamental had shifted in that moment, that the mask he wore had cracked and revealed something desperate beneath. She tried to hold on to that image, that flash of genuine emotion, but the fever pulled her down again into confused fragments of memory and sensation, and she felt movement, felt herself being carried, and Adrian's voice came to her through the haze telling her to stay with him, and she wanted to tell him that she was trying, that she did not want to slip away into the darkness, but her tongue would not form words, and she could only drift, could only surface occasionally into brief moments of painful clarity, where she saw the canopy of autumn leaves overhead and felt the rhythm of footsteps and understood dimly that he was carrying her, that he had not stopped or set her down, and the determination in his voice when he spoke to her was like a rope she could hold, could use to pull herself back from the edge. In one of those surfacing moments, when the pain sharpened enough to cut through the fever's fog, she managed to open her eyes and saw his face above her, saw the lines of exhaustion carved deep around his mouth, and saw the fierce concentration in his eyes, and she understood somehow that he had been walking for a very long time, that his arms must be screaming with the burden of her weight, but he had not faltered, would not falter, and the knowledge of it broke something open inside her chest that had nothing to do with the bullet wound, and she whispered through cracked lips the only words she could manage. "Don't stop," though she was not entirely certain what she meant by it, whether she meant the walking or something larger, something about the fragile thing that seemed to be building between them in this desperate journey. And then the darkness pulled her down again, but this time it felt less frightening because his arms were still around her, and his voice was still calling her name, like an anchor in the storm. Night had fallen with the quiet inevitability of a curtain descending on a tragedy, and Adrian had been walking for perhaps 6 hours, though he could no longer be certain of time or distance or anything beyond the weight in his arms and the burning agony that had spread through every muscle of his body, and his legs trembled with each step, threatening to buckle beneath him, his back screaming with pain that radiated down his spine and through his shoulders until he could not distinguish one source of torment from another, and Eleanor's breathing had become shallow and rapid, a terrible whispering sound that filled him with a fear more absolute than any he had known, and the road before him stretched into darkness so complete that he could barely distinguish the path from the forest on either side, and twice he stumbled on unseen ruts in the packed earth, nearly falling, catching himself at the last moment with a lurch that sent fresh waves of pain through his exhausted body and made Eleanor moan softly against his chest, and he realized with growing desperation that he was lost, that in the darkness he might have missed a turning or wandered from the main road entirely, that he could be carrying her deeper into the wilderness rather than toward salvation. He stumbled again, more severely this time, and his knee struck the ground hard before he could stop himself, and the impact jolted Eleanor in his arms, and he heard her breath catch in a way that suggested pain, and for a long moment he knelt there in the dark road with her cradled against him, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and fear, and the temptation to simply remain there, to rest, to surrender to the overwhelming fatigue, crashed over him with the force of a physical blow, and he looked down at Eleanor's face in the pale moonlight that filtered through the clouds, saw how white she had become, how still except for those terrible shallow breaths, and he thought with sudden clarity that she might die here, might die in his arms on this dark road, and it would be his fault, his responsibility, the final consequence of his cold calculations and callous disregard, and the despair of it was a weight greater than her body, was a crushing burden that made breathing difficult and thinking impossible. But then, kneeling there in the darkness with his wife dying in his arms, Adrian realized something that cut through the exhaustion and fear with absolute clarity. He could not lose her, would not accept a world in which Eleanor did not exist, and this realization had nothing to do with ships or fortunes or the practical concerns that had governed his entire life. And he understood in that moment of terrible honesty that, somewhere during those quiet weeks at Ravensmoor Hall, during those dinners where she sat across from him in patient silence, during those mornings when he passed her in the corridors and she offered small, tentative smiles that he never returned, somewhere in all those moments he had failed to notice or value, she had become essential, had become the only real thing in his carefully constructed world of ledgers and contracts and cold ambition, and the thought of returning to Ravensmoor Hall without her, of sitting at that long dinner table alone, and of walking through rooms that would echo with her absence, was unbearable, was impossible, was a future he would not accept. He stood slowly, his legs shaking so badly he wondered if they would hold him, and he adjusted his grip on Eleanor's limp form, felt her blood still warm against his chest, and he began walking again, one foot in front of the other, moving forward because the alternative was unthinkable, and he began to talk to her as he walked, his voice hoarse and raw but steady, and he told her about Ravensmoor Hall in spring, when the gardens bloomed with roses and lilacs and the air filled with their perfume, and he promised to show her those gardens, and to walk with her through them and learn the names of every flower. And he told her about the library where sunlight streamed through tall windows in the morning and created patterns on the floor, and he promised to read to her there, to share the books he loved, and he talked about the future as if speaking it aloud could make it real, could keep her tethered to life, and his feet kept moving through the darkness, kept carrying her forward, because love, he discovered, was not the gentle emotion poets described, but rather this fierce, desperate determination, this refusal to surrender, this willingness to walk until his body failed completely, if it meant even the smallest chance of saving her. Dawn broke over the horizon with the pale, tentative light of early autumn, painting the sky in shades of grey and gold, and Adrian had been walking through the entire night, his body moving now on something beyond physical strength, on some reserve of pure will that he had not known he possessed, and every step was agony, his legs no longer trembling but rather numb and distant, as though they belonged to someone else, his arms locked around Eleanor's still form, in a grip he could not have released even if he wished to, and his mind had narrowed to a single point of focus, a single driving need to reach help before it was too late. And then through the morning mist, he saw them, lights in the distance, the warm glow of lanterns and hearth fires that could only mean habitation, and the village he had passed a lifetime ago when Eleanor sat beside him in the carriage, and the world was ordinary and comprehensible, and hope surged through him with such force that it was nearly painful, that it brought tears to his eyes and fresh strength to his exhausted body. And he staggered forward faster, his stride uneven and desperate, covering the final half-mile with single-minded determination, and Eleanor stirred in his arms for the first time in hours, her eyelids fluttering open, her eyes unfocused but conscious, and she looked up at his face with an expression of such bewilderment, such disbelief, that he nearly sobbed with relief at seeing her aware, seeing her alive, and her lips moved and he bent his head to hear her whisper, her voice barely audible, "You carried me." And there was wonder in those 3 words, wonder and something else he could not quite name, and he found his own voice, though it emerged raw and broken from his throat. 20 miles, he answered, and the words felt inadequate to capture what those miles had contained, the fear and desperation and revelation. But then he heard himself continue, the truth emerging unbidden, "I would have carried you 1,000, and the words surprised even him with their absolute sincerity, with the depth of feeling they revealed, feelings he had not known he possessed until this moment. And Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though whether from pain or emotion he could not tell, and she said nothing more, but her hand moved weakly against his chest, and he understood it as acknowledgement, as acceptance, as perhaps the first fragile beginning of something that might one day become forgiveness. He reached the first houses of the village as full dawn broke, the sun cresting the hills and flooding the street with golden light, and he knew the doctor's house from his previous passage through, a neat cottage with a painted sign hanging above the door, and he staggered up the steps and pounded on that door with his shoulder, because he could not release his hold on Eleanor, pounded again and again with increasing desperation, until finally the door swung open and the doctor stood there in his nightshirt, an elderly man with kind eyes that widened as he took in the scene before him, the blood-soaked nobleman holding his dying wife, and the doctor asked no questions but simply stepped aside and gestured them in with urgent efficiency, calling for his housekeeper, clearing the table in his surgery with a sweep of his arm, and Adrian carried Eleanor to that table and laid her down with infinite care. And the moment her weight left his arms, he felt the world tilt and spin, felt his legs finally give way beneath him, felt himself falling, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Eleanor's pale face and the doctor bending over her with capable hands, and then there was nothing, nothing at all, only the black velvet of unconsciousness into which he surrendered gratefully, his body and mind finally releasing their burden now that she was safe, now that he had fulfilled his desperate promise to bring her home. Adrian woke to dim afternoon light filtering through lace curtains, his body sprawled in an unfamiliar chair in what he slowly recognized as the doctor's parlor, and for a moment he could not comprehend where he was or how he had arrived there, and then memory crashed over him with the force of a physical blow, Eleanor bleeding in his arms, the endless walk through darkness, the desperate pounding on the doctor's door, and he lurched upright with such violence that pain shot through every muscle, his back seizing, his legs cramping, but he ignored all of it and staggered toward the sound of low voices coming from the next room, and he pushed through the door to find the doctor washing his hands in a basin, while Eleanor lay on a narrow bed, so pale and still that Adrian's heart stopped until he saw the gentle rise and fall of her chest beneath the clean white bandages that wrapped her torso. And the doctor turned to him with a grave expression and explained in quiet professional tones that he had removed the bullet and stitched the wound, that she had lost considerable blood, but the bullet had missed vital organs by perhaps an inch, that she was alive but weak and fighting fever, that the next few days would be critical, and Adrian heard the words from a great distance as though underwater, heard only that she lived, that there was hope, and he moved to her bedside and sank into the chair there and took her hand in both of his, and the doctor said something about rest, about Adrian needing to recover his own strength, but Adrian shook his head and said, with absolute finality, that he would not leave her, would not move from this spot, and the doctor studied him for a long moment and then simply nodded and left them alone. The days that followed blurred together into a continuous vigil, time measured not in hours but in the rhythm of Eleanor's breathing, in the heat of fever that rose and fell beneath his touch, and Adrian sat beside her bed holding her hand, sleeping in fitful stretches in the chair when exhaustion overcame him, waking with a start whenever she stirred or cried out, and the doctor brought him food which he ate mechanically without tasting, brought him clean clothes which he barely acknowledged, and once the doctor commented with something like wonder that he had never seen a husband so devoted, and the words struck Adrian strangely because he realized that he had indeed become something he never was before, a true husband, a man whose world contracted to the compass of one person's suffering, whose prayers rose unbidden to a God he had ignored for years, whose hands learned the tender gestures of care as he cooled Eleanor's fever with damp cloths and read to her from the doctor's small collection of books when she grew restless in her delirium, his voice hoarse but steady, reading poetry and scripture and whatever else came to hand, and he talked to her constantly, telling her about Ravensmoor Hall and the changes he would make, the gardens they would restore together, the life they would build, speaking as though his words could anchor her to this world, could keep her from slipping away into the darkness that seemed always to hover at the edges of the sick room. On the third day her fever broke, and Adrian woke from an uneasy doze to find her eyes open, truly open for the first time since the attack, clear and cognizant rather than clouded with pain and delirium, and she looked at him with an expression of such wonder, taking in his disheveled appearance, his unshaven face, the blood-stained shirt he still wore because he had refused to leave her long enough to change it properly, and she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable, "You stayed," and there was a question in those words, disbelief that he would remain when he might have left her to the doctor's care and returned to his important business, and Adrian felt something break open in his chest, some last barrier of pride or self-protection crumbling, and he raised her hand to his lips and answered with absolute truth, "Always." Eleanor recovered slowly over the following days, her body healing with the resilience of youth but her strength returning in gradual increments. And Adrian never returned to the separate chair the doctor offered in his parlour, never left her bedside except for the briefest necessities. And as the acute danger passed and Eleanor could remain awake for longer periods, they began, tentatively, and with the awkwardness of strangers learning a new language, to actually talk, not the perfunctory exchanges of their marriage thus far, but real conversation, and it was Eleanor who breached the silence first, her voice still weak, but her gaze direct as she asked the question that lay between them like a chasm. "Why did you marry me?" "Adrian." And she used his given name for the first time. "I want to hear you say it." And he could have dissembled, could have offered comfortable lies, but something in her eyes demanded truth, and so he gave it to her, his voice quiet but steady, as he explained that he had needed the ships, the fortune, that his estate had been crumbling despite the grand title, that he had been weeks away from ruin when he learned of her father's death and the shipping empire that would pass to his daughter, and he watched her face as he spoke, saw no surprise there, only a kind of sad acknowledgement, and then he said something he had not planned, words that emerged from some deep place of newfound honesty. "But I was wrong to treat you as a transaction, Eleanor. I was wrong to see only what you could provide rather than who you are." And she was quiet for a long moment before asking, her voice softer now, "Who are you then, Adrian Blackwell?" And he found himself speaking of things he had never shared with anyone, of his childhood, in the cold halls of Ravensmoor, with a father who measured worth in ledgers and power, of impossible expectations and the gradual hardening of his heart, as he learned that emotions were weaknesses to be excised, and that affection was a luxury he could not afford. And Eleanor listened without interruption, and when he finished, she began to speak, haltingly at first, and then with gathering strength, about her father and the consuming grief of losing him, about the loneliness that had filled her life even before their marriage, about the shipping business her father had loved and taught her, treating her as the son he never had. And as she spoke, Adrian realized how profoundly he had failed to see her, how he had shared a house with this remarkable woman and treated her as invisible, and their conversation continued through the afternoon, the doctor bringing them tea which grew cold as they talked, and at some point their hands found each other on the coverlet, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that surprised them both, and neither pulled away, and the walls that had stood between them began to crumble, brick by brick, truth by truth, until the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge they were building together, word by careful word, as Eleanor grew stronger over the following week, able to sit up without dizziness and take brief walks in the doctor's small garden with Adrian's arm supporting her. Adrian found himself gripped by a compulsion he could not resist, a need to speak truths he had spent a lifetime concealing, and one afternoon, when she sat in the chair by the window with sunlight illuminating her face, still pale but gaining color each day, he pulled a stool close to her and said quietly, "Eleanor, there is more I must tell you." And she turned to him with those clear eyes that seemed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses, and he told her everything, holding nothing back. Now the full extent of the debts that had accumulated under his father's neglect and his own prideful mismanagement, the desperation that had driven him to seek a marriage of convenience, the calculated way he had pursued her after learning of her father's death, how he had reviewed the shipping manifests and trade agreements before he ever looked at her portrait, how he had stood beside her at the altar, thinking only of solvency and expansion, and never once considering the woman whose life he was binding to his own, and his voice grew rough with shame as he spoke, but he forced himself to continue because she deserved this honesty, deserved to know the full measure of his coldness, And then he told her something else, something he had discovered during those terrible hours carrying her through darkness. But somewhere on that walk, Eleanor, somewhere in those miles, I understood that none of it mattered, not the ships, not the fortune, not the empire I thought I was building, because the only thing I could think, the only thought in my mind beyond putting one foot in front of the other, was that I could not lose you, that you had become more essential to me than breath, and I do not know when it happened, whether it was some moment I failed to notice or a gradual accumulation of your quiet presence, filling spaces in me I did not know were empty. But I would give it all up, every ship, every contract, every pound, if it meant keeping you safe. And he saw tears gather in her eyes, though she did not look away, and after a long moment she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "What happens now? Adrian, do you expect my gratitude for this confession, my forgiveness for the coldness that preceded it?" And he shook his head quickly and said, "I expect nothing, Eleanor. I have forfeited any right to expectations." And then he took a breath and said what frightened him most, "But I am asking, if you can find it in yourself, for a chance not to return to what we were, because that was nothing, a hollow arrangement that benefited only me, but to begin again, to know you truly, to build something real from this broken foundation. And if you cannot, if the hurt is too deep, then I will accept that. But I had to ask, had to speak this truth." And Eleanor was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving from his face to the garden beyond the window, where spring flowers were just beginning to bloom. And when she finally looked back at him, there was something in her expression that was neither forgiveness nor rejection, but rather a kind of cautious possibility. And she said softly, "I need to think. Adrian, you have given me much to consider." And he nodded and rose to leave, to give her the space she needed. But as he reached the door, she said his name, and when he turned, she was watching him with an intensity that made his heart stutter, and she said, "But I am glad you stayed, glad you told me these things. It is more than you have given me in all the weeks before." And he held her gaze and answered, "It is less than you deserve, but it is all I have." And he left her there in the sunlight, his heart suspended between hope and despair, waiting for her choice. Eleanor sat alone in the small room the doctor had given her after Adrian left, the afternoon light shifting across the worn floorboards as she turned his words over and over in her mind, like stones worn smooth by water, and she recognized that she stood at a crossroads where the choice she made would determine not just the shape of her marriage, but the entire trajectory of her life. And she could, if she wished, hold onto her hurt like a shield, maintain the distance that had characterized their union from the beginning, return to Ravensmoor Hall and live as polite strangers, sharing a name and nothing more, and there would be a certain safety in that choice, a protection against further disappointment, against the vulnerability that came with allowing someone to matter. And part of her, the part that had learned caution through grief and loneliness, counseled exactly this path, whispered that his confession changed nothing fundamental, that a man who had married her for ships and fortune was simply trying to salvage a bad investment. But even as these thoughts formed, she knew they were lies she was telling herself, because fear was easier than courage, and she thought instead of that moment when she had woken in this very room to find him beside her bed, disheveled and exhausted, and still wearing her blood on his clothes, and she realized with startling clarity that he could have left her here with the doctor and returned to his business, could have ensured she had proper care while maintaining the comfortable distance he preferred, but he had stayed, had kept vigil beside her for days, and before that, he had carried her 20 miles through darkness, had chosen her life over the fortune she represented, over the practical considerations that had governed every decision he made. And she remembered surfacing briefly during that terrible walk, remembered seeing his face above her with an expression of such desperate determination that it had pierced even her fevered confusion, remembered his voice in the darkness telling her to stay with him, and she understood that whatever had begun between them during those hours was real, was perhaps the first real thing in their entire acquaintance. And yes, he had married her for her father's ships, had treated her with cold indifference, had failed to see her as anything more than a means to an end. And these truths hurt, would always hurt in some tender place deep inside her. But she also recognized truth in his confession, heard it in the raw honesty of his voice when he told her he would give up everything to keep her safe, and she thought of her father, who had taught her about navigation and trade winds and reading the stars, but who had also taught her that the greatest courage was not in avoiding storms, but in choosing to sail through them, and she realized that she could choose differently, could take the risk of believing that something real might grow from even the coldest beginning, that two people who had started as strangers bound by contract might become something more if they had the courage to be vulnerable. To build brick by careful brick, something neither of them had planned but both of them needed. And as the sun moved lower in the sky and the room filled with golden light, she felt the decision crystallize inside her, like ice becoming water, fear becoming possibility, and she knew what she would say when he returned. 2 weeks later, when the doctor finally declared Eleanor strong enough to travel, provided they took the journey slowly and stopped frequently for rest, Adrian arranged for the most well-sprung carriage he could hire in the village and lined it with every cushion and blanket the innkeeper could spare. And as he helped Eleanor into the carriage that morning, his hand supporting her elbow with infinite care, she noticed how different this departure felt from that terrible day when they had set out for Portsmouth, and indeed, everything about the journey back to Ravensmoor Hall bore no resemblance to the journey out, where before there had been silence broken only by the clatter of wheels and the occasional curt observation about landmarks. Now there was conversation that flowed easily between them, tentative at first, but growing more natural with each mile, and Adrian insisted they travel slowly, stopping every few hours so Eleanor could walk a bit and rest properly, and he watched her constantly with an attentiveness that was both touching and slightly amusing, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed more cushions, if the jostling pained her wound, until finally she laughed and said, "Adrian, I am not made of glass, I will not shatter." But there was warmth in her voice that took any sting from the words, and he smiled, that rare, genuine smile she was beginning to see more often, and said, "Forgive me, I find I cannot help myself." And they talked then about everything they had never discussed in those cold months at Ravensmoor Hall. She told him about her father's business, about the evenings spent in his study, learning about trade routes and manifests, and the intricate dance of supply and demand across the seas, and Adrian listened with an intensity that was wholly different from his previous dismissive efficiency, and he asked her opinions on decisions he was facing, on contracts he was considering, and Eleanor found herself sharing ideas her father had discussed with her before his death, innovations in cargo management and new routes that might prove profitable. And Adrian's amazement was evident as he said, "You have a mind for this, Eleanor, your father taught you well." And there was respect in his voice that warmed her more than any fire. And he told her about his travels before his father's death, about ports he had visited, and the vast complexity of maritime trade, and she asked about his childhood, and he spoke more openly than he ever had about the cold estate, where emotions were forbidden and weakness was punished, and she began to understand the armor he had built around himself. And when they reached the inn where they had stopped before, that place where the innkeeper had warned about bandits, and Adrian had arranged separate rooms without consultation, he turned to her as the carriage halted and asked quietly, "Eleanor, would you, that is, I could arrange separate rooms again, if you prefer, but I thought perhaps," and she understood what he was asking. This man who was learning vulnerability, one painful step at a time, and she said gently, "I would like to share a room, if the offer is genuine," and the relief in his face was answer enough. And that night they lay in separate beds in the dim firelight, and talked in the darkness about poetry she loved, and places he hoped to show her someday, and small dreams they had never shared with anyone. And his voice in the darkness was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity, and everything to do with the walls finally coming down. And when she finally drifted to sleep, she heard him whisper, "Good night, Eleanor," with such tenderness that she carried it into her dreams, and she understood that what they were building now was more intimate than many marriages ever achieved. This careful architecture of trust and genuine knowing, brick by patient brick. The carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ravensmoor Hall in the late afternoon, and as Eleanor looked up at the imposing stone facade that had seemed so cold and forbidding when she first arrived as a bride, she found that everything appeared different now, softened somehow by the transformation that had occurred not in the house itself, but in the two people returning to it. And Adrian helped her down from the carriage with such careful attention that Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper who had rushed out to greet them, stood frozen in surprise at the Duke's tender solicitude, And in the days that followed, Adrian set about making changes that announced to the entire household that something fundamental had shifted. He commissioned a portrait of Eleanor to hang in the main hall, where visitors would see it immediately upon entering, and he personally retrieved her father's portrait from the storage room, where it had languished, and placed it in the library in a position of honor, beside the shipping maps. And when Eleanor discovered this, she felt tears prick her eyes at the recognition implicit in the gesture. And Adrian had the connecting door between their bedchambers unlocked and left standing open, and that first night back he said quietly, "The choice is yours, Eleanor, always yours." And she looked at that open doorway and understood that he was offering not just physical proximity, but the vulnerability of allowing her into every aspect of his life, and she walked through it without hesitation and found him sitting by his fire. And they talked until the candles guttered low, and she fell asleep in the chair beside him with his coat draped over her shoulders, and they began establishing new rhythms that bore no resemblance to those cold early weeks. They took breakfast together in the morning room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows, and Adrian asked her thoughts on the day's business and listened intently as she offered suggestions drawn from her father's teachings. And they walked in the gardens, even as autumn deepened toward winter, and he asked her opinions on everything from tenant concerns to investment opportunities, and Eleanor found herself gradually taking a role in the shipping business that her father had built. And Adrian not only welcomed her involvement, but actively sought her counsel, including her in meetings with his steward and solicitors, and the men who had initially been skeptical soon recognized that the new Duchess had a mind as sharp as any businessman's, and the servants whispered among themselves about the change in their master, how the harsh lines around his mouth had softened, how he smiled now, how his eyes followed the Duchess with an expression that could only be called tender. And months passed in this manner, and the bare trees of winter giving way to the first green shoots of spring. And one evening, Eleanor brought tea to Adrian's study, where he was reviewing shipping manifests, and he looked up with such genuine pleasure at her arrival that her heart contracted with the sweetness of it, and he pulled her gently into his lap, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable in those early days, and she settled against him with easy comfort as they reviewed the documents together, her head resting on his shoulder, and she thought of how far they had traveled from that cold wedding day, how a marriage that began as pure transaction had transformed into something real and precious and entirely theirs, built brick by patient brick, from the ruins of a loveless arrangement into something that felt, finally, like home. 3 years had passed since that terrible day on the Portsmouth Road, 3 years since blood had soaked into autumn leaves, and a desperate man had carried his dying wife through 20 miles of darkness, and now in the late spring afternoon, Eleanor stood in the gardens of Ravensmoor Hall, watching their daughter, little Catherine, just past her 2nd birthday, toddle among the rose bushes with that particular concentrated determination that small children bring to their explorations, and Eleanor's laugh rang out clear and bright as Catherine discovered a butterfly and tried to catch it in her chubby hands. And from the terrace above, Adrian stood with a letter forgotten in his hands, a missive from his solicitor, informing him that the shipping company had doubled its profits under their joint management, and that the Ravensmoor name was now synonymous with maritime excellence. But his eyes were not on the letter but on his wife, on the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, now worn looser than fashion dictated, on the grace of her movements as she bent to scoop up their daughter, and something in his chest expanded with a contentment so profound it still surprised him sometimes. This man who had once believed himself incapable of such feeling, and Eleanor looked up as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the garden, and she smiled with such deep happiness that he found himself descending the terrace steps without conscious thought, drawn to her as he had been drawn every day since he had carried her bleeding body and discovered what truly mattered. And Catherine shrieked with delight as her father approached and held out her small arms imperiously, and Adrian scooped her up with the easy confidence of a man who had learned that showing love was not weakness, but the greatest strength, and he took Eleanor's hand with his free one, and they walked together through the gardens that had once seemed so cold and formal, but that Eleanor had transformed into something warm and alive, planting flowers her father had loved, and creating spaces where their daughter could play. And Eleanor rested her head against Adrian's shoulder as they walked, and sometimes, like now, when the weather changed or she moved in certain ways, the scar on her side ached with a dull, persistent reminder. But she found she did not mind it, for it marked the moment when everything had changed, when a marriage of cold transaction had been burned away in blood and desperation, and a man had discovered he could not bear to lose what he had never valued. And Adrian felt her slight wince, and immediately his arm tightened around her, and he asked quietly, "The scar?" "Oh." And she nodded, and he kissed her temple with infinite tenderness, and said what he said every time. "I am sorry you bear that mark." And she replied, as she always did, "I am not. It reminds me of the night you carried me, of the moment you became truly my husband." And Catherine, nestled between them, reached up to pat her mother's face with sticky fingers and declared, "Mama happy," with the certainty of a child who has never known anything but love. And Adrian looked at the house behind them, at Ravensmoor Hall, glowing warm in the golden afternoon light, its windows open to let in spring breezes, its rooms filled now with laughter and life, and all the messy, beautiful chaos of a family, and he thought of how he had stood on those same terrace steps 3 years ago, and watched this woman, who was still virtually a stranger, prepare for a journey. And he had felt nothing but cold calculation about shipping contracts and trade routes, and now she was the center of his entire world. And he whispered against her hair, "I love you," and she turned in his arms and kissed him softly and said, "I love you too." And they stood there in the garden they had built together, their daughter between them, and the house that had once echoed with emptiness was a home now, filled with a love that had grown from the most unlikely soil, watered by blood and desperation and the courage to begin again. The evening settled gently over Ravensmoor Hall as Adrian and Eleanor stood together on the terrace, where so much of their story had unfolded, his arm around her waist and her head resting against his shoulder in the easy intimacy of a couple who had travelled far from that cold wedding day when they had been strangers, bound by contracts and necessity, and they watched the last golden light fade from the gardens where their daughter had played earlier, now sleeping peacefully in the nursery above, and Eleanor traced the line of the scar beneath her gown with absent fingers and said quietly, "Do you ever think about that day on the Portsmouth Road, how differently everything might have gone?" And Adrian's arm tightened around her, and he said, "Every day I think of how close I came to losing you before I ever truly had you." And they stood in companionable silence for a moment before Eleanor turned to face him fully and said, "We have been very fortunate, have we not, to find love in such unlikely circumstances?" And he kissed her forehead and agreed that fortune did not begin to describe the grace that had transformed their transactional arrangement into something real and precious and entirely their own. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard this story and found yourself thinking of arrangements in your own life that began without love, of relationships that seemed destined to remain cold and practical, of moments when you wondered whether warmth could ever grow from such frozen soil. And if so, know that love is not always the thunderbolt of romance novels or the instant passion of fairy tales. Sometimes love is a choice made in the darkness, a decision to keep walking when your arms ache and your strength fails, a willingness to begin again when beginning seems impossible. And what Adrian and Eleanor discovered on that terrible day when blood soaked into autumn leaves was that the human heart is capable of profound transformation if given the courage to be vulnerable, if offered the grace of a second chance, if met with honesty about past wrongs and genuine commitment to building something better. The coldest arrangements can yield the warmest loves if both parties find within themselves the bravery to tear down walls built of pride and self-protection, and to speak truth, even when truth reveals ugly motivations and painful mistakes, to extend forgiveness when forgiveness seems undeserved, to trust again when trust has been broken, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that love is not merely a feeling but an action. It is the 20 miles walked through darkness, the vigil kept at a sickbed, the daily choice to honor and cherish what you once took for granted, the willingness to carry each other through whatever wilderness life presents. If you find yourself in a relationship that seems broken beyond repair, in a marriage that has become mere cohabitation, in a partnership where warmth has long since fled, do not dismiss the possibility of transformation too quickly, for what seems transactional or hollow may yet become something beautiful if you have the patience to nurture it, and the honesty to acknowledge where you have failed, and the courage to try again with open heart and genuine commitment. May you find, as Adrian and Eleanor found, that the most profound loves sometimes grow not despite difficult beginnings, but because of them, watered by the tears of recognition and fed by the soil of hard-won understanding. And may you have the strength to carry those you love through their darkest hours, knowing that in the carrying you may discover depths in yourself you never knew existed. And may you rest tonight in the peace of knowing that redemption is always possible, that cold hearts can learn to warm, that strangers can become beloved, and that love, true, deep, lasting love, can spring from even the most unlikely and unpromising circumstances if tended with patience and watered with grace. This story comes to you from Gentle Pages, where we believe in the transforming power of love and the possibility of second chances if this tale has touched your heart. Please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that even the coldest beginning can lead to the warmest ending. And may you find your own unexpected love. May you have the courage to begin again, and may you rest well tonight, dear listener, wrapped in the knowledge that transformation is always, always possible.